It starts quietly, almost invisibly. A casual scroll, a curious click, a moment of privacy that feels harmless. But what if that one habit is slowly reshaping how the brain experiences desire, how the body responds to intimacy, and how expectations of sex are being rewritten without awareness? What if the real effects of watching porn are not immediate, but gradual, subtle, and deeply rooted in both male and female sexual health? Welcome back to the Sexual Health Room. Let's dive deeper into our topic. Pornography directly interacts with the brain's reward circuitry, particularly the dopamine system. Every time explicit content is consumed, the brain releases dopamine, the same neurotransmitter linked with pleasure, motivation, and reinforcement. The catch is not the release itself, but the intensity and repetition. Unlike real-life intimacy, porn offers endless novelty, instant switching between scenes, and exaggerated stimulation. This creates a hyper-stimulated environment where the brain begins to associate arousal with artificial triggers rather than real human connection. The hook here is simple but unsettling. If the brain adapts to high-intensity stimulation, can normal intimacy ever feel enough again? In males, this adaptation often manifests as desensitization. Over time, the same content no longer produces the same level of arousal, leading to escalation in frequency or intensity of consumption. This is where a critical shift begins. The brain starts demanding more extreme or novel stimuli to achieve the same dopamine response. This is not just a behavioral pattern, it is neuroplasticity in action. The brain is literally rewiring itself. The deeper question emerges here. When arousal becomes dependent on artificial stimuli, what happens when real-life intimacy lacks that intensity? One of the most discussed consequences in male sexual health is porn-induced erectile dysfunction. Unlike physiological erectile dysfunction, this form is psychological and neurological. A man may find it difficult to achieve or maintain an erection with a real partner but has no issue during porn consumption. This disconnect highlights a conditioned response where the brain associates arousal with screens rather than physical presence. The tension builds here. If the body is physically capable, but the mind is conditioned otherwise, where does the real problem lie? Another layer involves performance anxiety. Porn often portrays unrealistic stamina, exaggerated reactions, and scripted scenarios that do not reflect real sexual experiences. When these become internal benchmarks, men may begin to feel inadequate. This anxiety feeds back into sexual performance, creating a cycle where stress inhibits arousal, and poor performance reinforces insecurity. The underlying hook tightens. When expectations are built on illusion, reality starts to feel like failure. For females, the impact operates differently but is equally significant. Porn consumption can influence body image, sexual expectations, and emotional responses to intimacy. Many portrayals emphasize unrealistic physical standards and scripted pleasure responses. Over time, this can lead to internal comparisons, where women evaluate their bodies and experiences against what they see on screen. The psychological effect is subtle but persistent. If what is seen becomes the standard, self-perception begins to distort. There is also the question of arousal patterns. Just as in males, repeated exposure can condition the brain to respond to specific visual or situational cues. This may lead to difficulty in experiencing arousal in real-life contexts that do not mirror those cues. The complexity here deepens. If arousal becomes linked to specific artificial scenarios, how flexible is natural sexual response? Emotional detachment is another dimension that often goes unnoticed. Porn typically separates physical acts from emotional connection. When consumed repeatedly, it can normalize this separation, subtly influencing how intimacy is perceived. For both males and females, this can reduce the emphasis on emotional bonding, communication, and mutual understanding in sexual relationships. The hook becomes sharper. If intimacy loses its emotional layer, does it remain intimacy or become mere stimulation? Frequency plays a crucial role in determining the extent of these effects. Occasional exposure may not lead to significant changes, but habitual consumption increases the likelihood of neurological and psychological shifts. The brain thrives on repetition. The more a pathway is used, the stronger it becomes. This is why patterns form and why they are difficult to break. The critical thought emerges here. When a habit feels normal, how often do people question its long-term impact? Another important aspect is the age of exposure. Early exposure during adolescence can have a stronger imprint because the brain is still developing. During this phase, neural pathways related to sexuality, relationships, and identity are being formed. Introducing highly stimulating and unrealistic content at this stage can shape expectations and responses in ways that persist into adulthood. The implication is direct: what is learned early often becomes the default. The conversation also extends to relationship dynamics. When one partner consumes porn frequently, it can create mismatched expectations or reduced interest in real-life intimacy. This may lead to misunderstandings, feelings of rejection, or decreased satisfaction within the relationship. The underlying tension builds again when virtual stimulation competes with real connection. Which one takes priority? What makes this topic complex is that the effects are not identical for everyone. Some individuals may not experience noticeable changes, while others may face significant impacts on arousal, satisfaction, and emotional connection. The variability depends on frequency, psychological factors, relationship context, and individual sensitivity. The final hook in this part lingers: if the effects are not always immediate or obvious, how many people are already influenced without realizing it? What feels like control often turns out to be conditioning. The mind begins to follow patterns it never consciously chose, and the line between preference and dependency starts to blur. The question that quietly surfaces is this: when desire is shaped repeatedly by artificial stimulation, is it still natural, or has it been engineered over time? As exposure continues, the concept of escalation becomes more pronounced. The brain, having adapted to a certain level of stimulation, starts seeking variation. This is not always a conscious decision. It is a neurological response driven by tolerance. Content that once felt exciting begins to feel ordinary, leading to longer sessions, more explicit material, or constant switching between videos. The hook tightens here: if satisfaction keeps shifting further away, does consumption ever truly fulfill, or does it just prolong the search? In males, this escalation can deepen the disconnect between mental arousal and physical response. The body may respond quickly to visual stimuli on a screen, yet struggle in real-life situations that lack the same intensity or novelty. This creates a fragmented arousal system, where desire exists but is context-dependent. The deeper implication emerges: if arousal depends on a specific environment, how adaptable is it in real intimacy? Delayed ejaculation is another pattern often linked with excessive consumption. The body becomes accustomed to a certain type of stimulation, often faster, more intense, or more controlled than what occurs during partnered intimacy. As a result, reaching climax in real-life situations may take significantly longer or feel difficult. This is not just a physical issue but a conditioned response. The hook lands sharply: when the body learns one pattern repeatedly, can it easily unlearn it? For females, the conditioning can influence both psychological and physiological responses. Repeated exposure to highly stylized portrayals of pleasure may create confusion about what genuine arousal feels like. Some may find themselves comparing their responses, questioning whether their experiences align with what they have seen. This internal conflict can reduce confidence and create hesitation during intimacy. The tension builds. If expectations are externally shaped, how authentic do personal experiences feel? There is also an emerging link between frequent porn consumption and reduced libido in real-life contexts for both genders. This seems counterintuitive at first. More exposure might suggest increased desire, but the opposite can occur. When the brain is consistently satisfied through artificial means, the motivation to seek real interaction can decrease. The reward system becomes efficient in isolation. The hook here is subtle but powerful: if the brain finds an easier path to satisfaction, will it still pursue the more complex, real one? Attention and focus during intimacy can also be affected. Porn often promotes rapid scene changes and constant novelty, which can shorten attention span in sexual contexts. Real intimacy, on the other hand, requires presence, patience, and connection. This mismatch can make real experiences feel slower or less stimulating. The underlying question grows stronger: if the mind is trained for constant novelty, can it remain engaged in a single, real moment? Another layer involves emotional and relational expectations. Porn rarely portrays communication, consent discussions, or emotional nuance. Over time, this absence can shape assumptions about how intimacy should unfold. For some, this may lead to reduced communication with partners or unrealistic expectations about responses and behaviors. The hook presses deeper. When learning comes from scripted visuals rather than real interaction, how accurate is that learning? Body image concerns intensify further in this phase. For males, comparisons may revolve around performance, stamina, or physical attributes. For females, it often centers on appearance and perceived desirability. These comparisons are rarely fair, yet they influence confidence and comfort during intimacy. The psychological burden becomes clear. If self-worth starts aligning with unrealistic standards, how stable does confidence remain? Sleep patterns and overall mental health can also be indirectly affected. Late-night consumption, prolonged screen time, and the cycle of stimulation followed by fatigue can disrupt natural rhythms. Over time, this can contribute to reduced energy, irritability, or decreased motivation. The connection might seem distant, but it is cumulative. The hook here shifts perspective. When a habit begins to affect areas beyond sexuality, how isolated is its impact? Another important dimension is secrecy. Many individuals consume porn privately and avoid discussing it with partners. This lack of transparency can create emotional distance in relationships. Even without explicit conflict, a sense of disconnection can develop. The tension becomes more relational. If one aspect of life remains hidden, how complete is the connection between partners? For some, guilt and internal conflict begin to surface. This may stem from personal values, cultural influences, or awareness of changing habits. The mind enters a loop where consumption continues, yet discomfort increases. This internal friction can affect self-esteem and emotional stability. The hook becomes introspective. When behavior and belief are misaligned, which one eventually shapes the other? The frequency and context of consumption continue to determine the intensity of these effects. What starts as occasional exposure can gradually integrate into daily routine. The brain does not differentiate between intentional and habitual repetition, it simply strengthens the pathways being used. The implication becomes direct: patterns are formed not by intention, but by repetition. The broader picture reveals that the effects are not limited to isolated symptoms but form a network of interconnected changes. Neurological conditioning influences physical response, which in turn affects psychological perception and relational dynamics. Each layer reinforces the other, making the impact more complex over time. The final hook in this part settles in. If multiple systems are being influenced simultaneously, is the effect still a small habit, or has it become a structural shift in how sexuality is experienced? Part 3. The most critical shift does not happen suddenly. It builds quietly until it starts defining behavior, response, and even identity. What once felt like a choice begins to feel like a pattern, and what once felt optional starts influencing how desire, satisfaction, and connection operate at their core. The question that now becomes unavoidable is this: when a repeated habit starts shaping not just actions but perception itself, how deep does its impact really go? At this stage, the brain's reward system is no longer just responding, it is anticipating. Triggers become automatic. A certain time of day, a moment of boredom, or even emotional discomfort can activate the urge. This is where conditioning reaches a more advanced level. The brain begins to associate relief, escape, and pleasure with the same behavior. The hook intensifies. If the mind starts using a single outlet for multiple needs, does it remain a preference, or does it become dependency? In males, prolonged patterns can lead to a more persistent form of arousal dysfunction. The gap between virtual stimulation and real-life response may widen further, making it increasingly difficult to maintain consistency in physical intimacy. What makes this more complex is that the issue is not always visible or immediately acknowledged. Many continue normal routines while experiencing subtle dissatisfaction or inconsistency. The deeper implication emerges: if performance becomes unpredictable, how does that uncertainty affect confidence over time? There is also the element of emotional withdrawal. As artificial stimulation becomes more accessible and predictable, real relationships may begin to feel demanding or uncertain in comparison. Real intimacy involves vulnerability, communication, and mutual responsiveness, none of which are guaranteed or controlled. This contrast can lead some individuals to subconsciously prefer the certainty of solitary stimulation over the complexity of shared experiences. The hook sharpens. When control becomes more appealing than connection, what happens to relationships? For females, prolonged exposure can lead to a layered impact involving both emotional and physiological responses. Some may experience a decline in spontaneous desire, while others may feel disconnected from their own natural arousal patterns. The constant comparison with scripted portrayals can create a silent pressure to respond in certain ways, even when those responses are not authentic. This creates a divide between genuine feeling and perceived expectation. The tension deepens. If responses are influenced by external models, how much of the experience remains truly personal? Another dimension that becomes more evident over time is intimacy dissatisfaction. When the brain has been conditioned to expect rapid stimulation, visual intensity, and constant novelty, real-life experiences may feel less engaging. This does not necessarily mean that real intimacy lacks value. It means the brain's reference point has shifted. The hook lands firmly. If expectations are calibrated to extremes, can normal experiences ever feel fulfilling without recalibration? The concept of emotional bonding also undergoes subtle changes. Intimacy is not solely physical, it involves trust, communication, and shared vulnerability. When repeated exposure normalizes detachment from these elements, the depth of connection in real relationships may diminish. Conversations about needs, boundaries, and preferences may become less frequent or less effective. The implication becomes clear: if communication weakens, the foundation of intimacy begins to erode. Another critical factor is the reinforcement loop. The more an individual relies on artificial stimulation, the more the brain strengthens that pathway, making alternative forms of satisfaction less appealing or more effortful. This loop is self-sustaining. Reduced satisfaction in real-life intimacy can lead to increased reliance on porn, which further deepens the disconnect. The hook becomes cyclical. If the solution to dissatisfaction reinforces its own cause, how easily can the cycle be broken? Mental health intersects with this pattern in complex ways. Feelings of isolation, reduced motivation, or low mood can both contribute to and result from excessive consumption. The behavior becomes both a coping mechanism and a contributing factor. This dual role makes it difficult to identify where the problem begins and where it ends. The deeper question emerges: when a habit serves as both relief and cause, how is it addressed at its root? There is also the issue of perception distortion. Over time, repeated exposure to exaggerated scenarios can subtly influence beliefs about relationships, consent, and sexual norms. These beliefs may not always be consciously recognized, but they can shape expectations and interactions. This distortion can create misunderstandings or mismatched expectations between partners. The hook presses further. If perception itself is altered, how accurate are the conclusions drawn from it? In long-term relationships, the cumulative effect becomes more visible. Differences in desire, expectations, or satisfaction may gradually surface. One partner may feel disconnected or inadequate, while the other may struggle to align real experiences with internalized patterns. These differences are not always openly discussed, which can lead to emotional distance. The tension builds again. If the gap remains unaddressed, does it stay small, or does it widen over time? Another aspect that cannot be ignored is time displacement. Time spent consuming content replaces time that could be invested in real interactions, personal growth, or rest. This shift may seem minor in isolation, but over weeks, months, and years, it accumulates. The impact extends beyond sexual health into overall lifestyle and well-being. The hook becomes broader. When a habit consistently replaces more meaningful activities, what is its true cost? The body itself also adapts to repeated patterns. Just as the brain forms neural pathways, the body becomes accustomed to specific types of stimulation, frequency, and intensity. This adaptation can make natural variations in real intimacy feel less effective or less satisfying. The connection between mind and body becomes tightly linked through repetition. The implication is direct: when both systems adapt together, change requires effort at multiple levels. The overall impact of watching porn on male and female sexual health is not defined by a single outcome but by an evolving interaction between neurological conditioning, psychological perception, physical response, and relational dynamics. Each layer influences the others, creating a system where cause and effect are continuously linked. What begins as a simple habit can evolve into a complex pattern that shapes how intimacy is experienced, understood, and valued. We hope you like the video. Press the like button and hit the share. Don't forget to subscribe to the Sexual Health Room and press bell icon for future videos.